like all of the other avenues of movement, the way we think about God changes everything. Whether we know it or not, it creates a shift. So the way that we think about God inevitably reshapes how we think about community, right? Like what community means, how that is. These are new. If you can get them on the way out or in the middle, it's fine with me. And if there's not enough, there's more on the copier. I just got to have Mike get them in a minute when he comes back. So how we think about God will reshape what we think about community. And for generations, the church has kind of worked in what we would call a bound set. It's defined by boundaries. And the theology of the church, specifically in early modernity, has really rested itself in determining the question of who's in and who's out of this bound set. In fact, if I were to draw it up here, if I had a capacity to draw on my iPad and it show up here, what I could show you even is a bunch of different interlocking circles of who deems who in and who out, and where those cross over in inness and where they cross over in outness, just within our Christian denominations alone, right? You would begin to see that. And it rests on conversations about who believes the right things, who qualifies for belonging, and what are those parameters for that. But there's a missiologist named Paul Hibert, along with others, who have shown that Jesus really operated in a different frame than the bound set that we've kind of migrated to. And that is what they call a centered set. So this would be the side with everybody in the circle is the bound set. The other side is a graphic of the centered set. Hebert would argue that in a bound set, the boundaries themselves define the belonging. But in a centered set, movement towards the center defines your belonging. And that center, theologically, in a centered set, can represent different things, right? Just like a bound set can. I think we would want to say, no, the centered set is so much different. It is different, but where they're naming those connections will depend on what theology you set in. So it could, for example, be the center is love, that this is where we find our center, and what we're defining ourselves is how we're moving toward that center. In Acts 10, Peter's vision, if you remember, he's sitting up on the roof, has an after dinner buzz or whatever that is, and sees this beautiful moment with a sheet being lowered down and all of the things that he had been taught his entire life as being unclean. He hears the voice of God. He recognizes it as God's voice, and it says to him, "Take and eat." And in his dream, he says to God, "Are you kidding me? I'm not eating that. That's unclean." Bound set, right? No, you've determined the boundaries, God. You've drawn the circle. You've shown us what's on it and what's not. 3 times he has this kind of conversation with God. And then God says, listen, if I call it clean, it's clean. And this is a radical moment for Peter of moving from a bound set to a centered set. That the center is all that God is, right? And as long as you're moving toward God, you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. That's the space that he's articulating. So what God's made clean, you must not call unclean. And this, whether we understand it or not, I've talked about this over and over. It is a theological earthquake. This is huge. Right? Because where does Peter get this information? Where did he get his information about what's on the sheet and not? You can talk back. Huh? Religious leaders. Sacred texts. Right? All of the things where we get our understanding are the same places where Peter got his understanding. It was not made up for him. This was a theological earthquake for him. The things that he understood, that he had been taught his entire life, even walking with Jesus, having had that experience, this comes after walking with Jesus, right? And he's still in this space of, wait, there's this circle God. This is the way that it works. This is what's in, this is where it's out. I know this, I'm comfortable in this. And the old boundaries crumble, and the Spirit shifts the set from a bound set to a centered set. And lest you think it ends with Peter, that's the movement forward from Acts chapter 2 to the end of Acts, is multiple people having their ideas of who's in and who's out, what's a bound set versus a centered set. Everybody's having a theological earthquake together at different times. Like today, we had an earthquake. Did you feel it? Yeah. I didn't. Mike did. He's the one who told me we were having it. So the church that migrates with the Spirit is not obsessed, it can't be obsessed with these kind of boundaries. It's got to be captivated by the center set of Christ and Christ's love, its gravitational pull. And it's going to take us places that make us all uncomfortable and that give us, I don't know why it's doing that, Mike, sorry. What it's giving us theological earthquakes as well. So a centered set faith begins to welcome difference. It begins to see diversity as a divine design, that somehow the difference that I'm bumping up into is part of what the Spirit's doing. Right? So if I'm having contact with people who are different, like Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch, there's a purpose. There's something happening here. Or like the centurion who knocks on my door and says, hey, I heard you're going to come and teach me all about the centered reality of God's love. Oh, I'm going to go with you. And I'm not only going to just go with you, but I'm going to come into your house and I'm going to eat with you. And all of your unclean things, I'm going to sit on them. And I'm going to have this whole experience. One of the things Roy reminds me of is that real hospitality is not when somebody comes into your house and they sit on your couch. Real hospitality is when you go to their house and sit on their couch. Because it's harder, right? We bump into things that might make us more uncomfortable. That's part of the challenge of that. So a centered set faith welcomes difference, sees this diversity as design, and trusts that that movement toward Christ, toward love, is actually what the uniting principle is. Not this held set circle. So part of the challenge of being a centered set community, right, is like, how do we make love and Christ's love the access point of which we move and bounce and turn. And it means that whatever person, their race, their gender, sexuality, their story is already in the gravitational pull of that love, right? That God is already at work in this place. So you can see how this shift of understanding God differently, of being God is love, then creates this community that is, the entire purpose of that community is to move toward that love. And what makes you a part of that community is that you're moving toward that love. But you're bumping into a lot of people who may be moving to it in a different way than you, and that you're trying to figure out what that means. And I would even challenge to say that maybe understand it differently than us, or even the way we've been taught. And that feels hard in the midst of all of this. So, our first question, we won't do all three of these, but our first question is, where have you experienced bounded religion? And, we're talking about our own movements from something to something. So where have you experienced bounded religion, and how are you with that now? Like, where are you in that movement in the moment? Yeah.
I have a clarifying question.
Yeah, please.
Your graphic showed all of the little people not going towards the center, but going off in chaotic directions away from the center sometimes. Was that intentional?
It was, to make us a bit more uncomfortable.
How does it fit with?
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Does that mean that does it mean that it's not working?
No, it does not at all mean it's not working. It means that if the centered set is God and God's love, and people are moving throughout life, they are intersecting with that regularly, and we're also intersecting with each other. So for me, it's almost like atoms bouncing off of each other and doing this interplay energy thing together. And what links us together in this is our movement to and sometimes away from, and all of these things are a part of human journey, right? So it's a fallacy to say that we're always moving toward the center.
But isn't that the goal?
It can be the goal all at once. My point is bounded set is messy, so is centered set. Right? Like, part of what I'm trying to do through this whole project is to just make the waters a bit more muddy.
Thank you.
Okay, so it's maybe neither is meant to be like, this is the correct way, like all the green people on the left one are not, all the right on people just might be that there are people who happen to be in that way.
Exactly.
And the other one is like, we all hope to be following the way of Jesus, but maybe we need to repent and turn around and go toward Jesus again.
Yeah, and these people most likely have their own circle, right? Like, if I were to draw all the little circles up here of like, they have their own circle and they're looking at these people and saying, man, they're out. And these people are saying, man, they're out. Like, I had a conversation with one of our students this week where she said, man, I'm glad I'm Christian and not Catholic. And I was like, what? Girl, we need to have a coffee. And so, she's a junior high girl, and we sat down together, and I was like, just so you know, Christians and Catholics are both Christians. They're just different bound sets in how we talk about this. You're a Lutheran, and that's your circle, even though none of us know what that means. And they're a Catholic, and they know what that means, and that's their bound set. But we're following the same Jesus person and the same God person and moving towards love, hopefully. But yeah, so, there's a lot. For me, these images are just to name that there is this way of a bound set, and there's a way of saying there's a different way of doing this that I would say is a healthier way, but it's not perfect.
So would it be fair to say that the intention of portraying it this way is to kind of like keep us all humble, lest we all think like, well, I'm following Jesus, and so I've got it down.
100%, and that to me goes into what we're talking about tonight, which is developing a different missional imagination. And I think that requires, as we head into the future, a much deeper sense of humility than we entered into it in the 1900s.
Well, of what Derek was saying. I asked that same question to people going out there. We were watching the thing on YouTube the other day about a bunch of different places in Russia. There's one town that is a totally pagan town. They worship pagan gods. And they like that because,
They're totally separate.
well, the whole town is separate. They're all worshipers. So they get around a tree in a small village. And they like that because they don't like the God that they're worshiping today because he didn't do what they wanted him to do. They could do another God. So, how many of those people are not being drawn? And I think we're all God's children. And he wants us, he draws us to him. But there are a lot of people that are just saying, no, I don't have anything to do with that. I'm going that direction.
Yeah.
At that moment.
And that, we don't know what's going to happen later in their life.
And guess what? Moral lesson for tonight, it's not our job to know that. It's not our job to know that. To know which way they're going or what that means. In fact, it's not even up for our conversation. Right? And so, yeah, people are moving. And, the only thing I would add to what you said is, right, when we talk about pagan people changing which God that they pick based on whether it worked or not, I know 1,000 Christians who do that exact same thing, right? They just, in fact, welcome to Walnut Creek, where every single person that I've met in this church, minus maybe 10%, have gone to 1 or 7 other churches in Walnut Creek and didn't like something and moved on, or had a faith development and moved on, and that's life, right? And don't hear judgment in that. That's true of every community in America doing this faith thing, trying to figure it out. It's part of the journey.
Can I push back though?
Sure.
What you were just saying about it's not our job. So I'm thinking about Jesus meets a pagan, the Roman centurion, was a pagan, and says, I have not seen such great faith in all of Israel. And so he's, if you will, judging him in a positive way, and saying, like, you are going in the right direction. You're going towards the kingdom of God. And then the flip side of that negatively would be, if our center is love, then I think it's very much our business to say, I don't know, to name an easy example, Jeffrey Epstein is not going in the right direction.
Yeah.
And to just call people on their...
Yeah, if I was not saying there should not be judgment. We all make judgments all day long. What I was saying, I'm talking about an eternal system where I'm saying it's my role in this bound set. Like in that bound set, in many bound sets, I'm the person who reveals to you who is saved and not saved. Right?
Can't Scripture do that? For example, all the warnings that we have in Scripture, you need to walk toward the center, and then you get to those people that on the last day, they say, but Lord, we did miracles, we cast out demons. And Jesus says, get away, I never knew you.
Yeah, so
What do we do with those people in the unbound set?
I don't do anything with them other than love them.
But isn't loving them trying to get them to walk toward that love center?
It can be. That can also be a really harmful thing depending on how you do it. If you're going to take a book and shove it in their face and say, see right here? See? You pagan? Right? No, that's not helpful. And most likely you're going to turn people away. You can have that methodology. People do, right? I started the class by talking about sitting at the Rose Bowl parade, and I was sitting there with my parents, and it was before the Rose Bowl parade started, and they were trying to clear the pathway, and up from that whole group was a large group of people carrying giant banners that said, you're going to go to hell tonight, God hates fags, you name the proper sign. And I got so angry And I had this just moment where the Spirit said to me, Rustin, if you believed that people were drowning, wouldn't you do anything you could to rescue them, even if you thought there was a limited chance?
I like the Good Samaritan.
And I said, pause for a second. And I said, I get it. I radically disagree with the methodology. It's not mine. I don't have to live in that. And there might be a 1% chance that somebody in that group, that's the thing that speaks to them in that moment, and it moves them in a step, and great. But it doesn't have to be mine, right? So we're going to have different methodologies. We're going to have different ways of moving towards that center. Love's going to mean one thing to you and something different to me. And I know that makes all the non-postmodern people in the room really crazy, because we really want to say, no, this is the way that you do it. Here is the Roman road. Here is the four spiritual laws. Here is your chick track. Here is this thing. And you can have all of those. That's not going to be my way. It can be yours, right? It's just not the way that I'm moving toward love. My way is never going to be to convince somebody that they're the goat. It's just not. I know a lot of preachers and church members and who that is their way. Let me convince the world. Let me spend a lot of time revealing to people how they're goats so that they'll know they need God. My way is to show people how they're already a child of God, that God loved them from the beginning, that God's never left them. In fact, it's been in the midst of them the entire time, right up next to them. They've been bumping into God their entire life. That's my methodology, right? So do I have personal judgment towards those others? Hell yes. I do, of course. It comes naturally for all of us. But can I open myself up enough to say, man, if I think people are drowning, that I would do anything I can to save them? I'm doing anything I can to help people know the love of God, because for me, living in the centered reality of God's love has made my existence more whole and better, and it's worth living for. Frankly, I know this drives some people crazy. I don't care about the afterlife. You can. I'm okay with that. The Bible does in places.
Yeah, he says,
Yeah.
get away from it.
Yeah. Again, the Bible does in places. It's just not that's not where I'm centered. All of us can't be centered in all places at all time, right? We're in our journey in the river. The metaphor from last week. The water is cutting through the land, and we're all in the water. We're just in different places in the water. That's why this idea of theology that's moving, that we're from somewhere and we're going to somewhere. I was at lunch today, and the waitress said to me, "Are you from here?" And I said, "Well, are you asking me if I live in Walnut Creek in Concord, or are you asking me, am I from this area?" And she said, And then she was like, "Well, let's go with both," right? And so then we had this conversation. That is a part of what we're talking about in this journey, is to give us resources, right? To give wherever we are. Some of us need resources for our own journey right now because we feel like we're in that water and we're drowning, and we need some life vests, or better yet, a canoe. Some of us are swimming happy in our water, right? Some of us have been treading water and we're about to give out, but we don't even know it yet. And my point is when you do give out, the water keeps moving. Let it carry you. Don't hold onto the rock and drown. The presence of God and God's movement in our life is much bigger than what we hold in this moment, and always will be. Fair enough? Now, what about the Good Samaritan?
Well, I'm just saying that the Good Samaritan, before he went up and picked that guy up, didn't go through a litany of questions of who he was, what he did, where he's from, if he was, a follower or not. He just picked him up.
Absolutely.
And I think that's what is moving toward the center about.
Yeah.
We're passing all kinds of those guys on the route.
And sometimes I'm the guy on the route.
When I look at those two, I'm seeing, I guess I'm seeing in the centered set, like if we're a church body that is more geared around a centered set type of mentality. I mean, I see that as two different kinds of churches.
100%. Well, definitely there are two separate types of being together, right? And that could be a religious community, that could be a home, that could be a family, right? There's some families that look just like this, and their tables aren't open, and they're, yeah. And I think when we talk about centered set versus bounded set, we have to go to its most simple formation, right? I was listening to a speaker this last week who, the guy was asking, well, how do you have, used to you could hire a black pastor and then black people would come to your church. And the black pastor who was speaking said, that was never true. What black people want to know is who's sitting at your table. You want to know how more black people or Asian people or Latino people will come to your church? Is that they're sitting at your dinner table because they're in relationship, they're connected, and that you're sitting at their dinner table. Then you can talk about hiring practices, right? And so some of this is a challenge to us in the barest form of what it means to be together. Are we boundary people? And I don't mean boundaries psychologically. So are we building fences or are we building tables? What are we doing? How's that play? So.
And this image also reminds me of the times that personally, when I see someone who has no idea what their faith is, but you can see them being drawn. You can tell that there's something working in them, like I want to think of a seeker.
Yeah.
Or someone who doesn't even know they're a seeker yet, but who's asking those kinds of questions.
Yeah.
Or showing interest. I mean, and then there are Christians who are believers, but sometimes they're, in terms of living, are they actually following the way of Jesus, or do they just have a set of beliefs and they're actually walking the opposite way, but they don't even know it? I mean, that's why I think this is also confusing.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't have anything to, it has to do sometimes with the label of how you would define yourself. Like, if someone asked me if I was a Christian, I'd say yes.
Yeah.
So that's a boundary right there. But hopefully my life would be exhibiting that without that being the final definition.
Yeah,
Just because I say it.
yes. So there's a story I heard once about a river at the edge of a village. And every spring, the river would rise and it would flood the fields and flood homes. And every spring, the villagers formed a long human chain across the mud, and they would pass buckets of water from one person to the next, trying to fight back the flood. And it is year after year, generation after generation, learned how to make bucket brigades, believing that that was their sacred duty, to keep the waters at bay. Then one day, there was a young woman who walked upstream, not because she was rebellious, not because she wanted attention, simply because she was curious. She wanted to know why the river kept rising. And what she found was startling. Fallen trees over generations had clogged the narrow bend of the river, and the river was choking. The flood was not a punishment of the people over time, it was congestion. So she climbed in the cold current of the waters, and she began to pull branches loose from generations of junk that had clogged the river. And the water began to move again. Now, her quiet discovery changed everything the village believed about the water and about their work. They didn't abandon the bucket lines. They did, however, begin to ask a deeper question. Are we meant to fight the river or to heal the river? This is the idea of missional migration. Missional migration is the movement from inherited habits of doing things for God toward discerning what God is already doing in our world and joining in. Often with people who may not look, act, or think like us, or P.S., even believe like us, or get this, maybe even call God by the same name as us. It's the shift from believing our job is to protect the world from flooding to understand we're invited to walk upstream, unclog the stuck places, and participate in the river's healing. It's as theologian John Sabrino reminds us that Christ's death on the cross should actually call us to make sure no more people are being put on crosses. It's the movement from conversion to incarnation, from extracting to embodying love. It's the journey from religious colonialism to holy collaboration. It's the movement from building churches to thinking about what it means to cultivate the kingdom of God. So part of what we're exploring is how mission itself moves, how our understanding of God's work evolves, how our part in that work matures. Brian McLaren writes that faith is joining the movement of love. Gustav Gutierrez says that liberation is not an optional ministry, but actually the heartbeat of God. Dallas Willard says that the kingdom of God is not a distant reward, but actually a present reality we're called to participate in. Henry Nouwen reminds us that the healer is also always the wounded. N.T. Wright insists that the early church did not spread a religion so much as they announced a new creation blooming in the cracks of the old one. So missional migration is about developing a new missional imagination that sees Christ already at work in our world and then steps into the flow. Right? Walking upstream together. So for many of us, you grew up going on mission trips, right? Missions began as something we did out there. It was a mission trip. It was a service day. It was an evangelism campaign. I remember my first evangelism campaign was one that involved a hand, and each finger meant something different. And we literally went to every house in our entire town of 2,000 people, and we walked through this hand thing over dinner to share the love of God in the midst of that. And we were taught that there was a line between sacred space and secular space, and part of our job was to carry God from one side, meaning the sacred space, into the secular space. But I think one of the things that, well, I truly believe that every generation will eventually discover what Jesus never tired of saying. God's already there. Thanks. God's already there. He was there before you got there. He was there before you even knew that place existed. He was there before that place even existed. So mission was never meant to be carrying God to godless places. It was always, I think, about being transformed by the encounter with God who is already present in conversation together, right? Marjorie Suhaki says that true evangelism is when one person sits down with another and they both leave changed because we've met each other in a different way. Early Christians called this reconciliation. Jesus called it the kingdom. Paul called it the renewal of all things. Gutierrez calls it liberation. Willard calls it participating in the divine conspiracy of love. Nouwen calls it the ministry of mutual healing. Mission is not first about what we accomplish. Mission is about who we all are becoming together. Nouwen would say we don't go in the world to fix it. We go into the world to be fixed, to be softened, to be opened, to be converted again and again towards the center set. So this is why Jesus, I think, this is why Jesus sends his disciples out with nothing. Take no bag, take no extra tunic, take no safety plan or strategy, and then he sends them out unguarded so they discover dependence. That they have to depend on the people that they're bringing the message to. Humility, partnership, beautiful improvisation, joy. He sent them so that they would be changed. So missional migration begins with the recognition that the world is not an object of our charity. It's a companion in our transformation. So here's the question. Where am I? When you think back on the earliest versions of mission you were taught or modeled, what did it look or feel like? And what assumptions shaped that early understanding?
That's an easy one for me. When I was little, missionaries used to visit, show slideshows, little huts in Africa, and new churches that were started. And it was definitely more the old, we are going to them out of love. But, you know, because we need to hear about Jesus. I don't think necessarily it was to learn from them. But I think that happened, especially with missionaries I most clearly remember were Wycliffe.
Yeah.
And they lived in those villages, created an alphabet for them. I mean, spent years and built incredible relationships. So I'm a little questioning, this seems a little bit here or there.
It's not.
And it's just such a beautiful mix of all of it.
But more frequently than not. So I'm going to challenge back on this a little bit. You know my grandfather was a missionary to the Navajo, right? I spent my summers going to churches with my grandfather so that he could do the work you're talking about. So I'm all in, I get it. And my grandfather was not a missionary like other missionaries. He was deemed one of the wise ones and invited to powwows and sat with people and did sweat lodges. But he was almost kicked out of the Southern Baptist Convention because he would go to sweat lodges. Right? So while I hear what you're saying that there is this gray space, agreed, there is this gray space, but that is not the history of what the mission of the church has been since the 1800s.
Totally, and I wanted to say the second part, Oh, what did it look like? I guess, because I was going to say, my view of mission changed a lot with focusing more on just relational ministry and getting to know, your life.
Yeah. So for you, one of the assumptions that was a good assumption, right, was that mission, being missional, was relational, right?
And going into their,
Yeah.
I'm not just saying, you need to come here to my church.
Yeah. Sarah?
My experience or some of my friends' experiences is just the opposite of, I think, the long-term missions of building that relationship, but then the short-term missions, sometimes they're seen as, we're the in, they're the out, we know God, they do not, I'm right, they're wrong, and it's very much not a relational thing, building that relationship, but more of a, I'm trying to think of the right word, I want to change your mind and not have a relationship with you. So I'm going to go to this place for a week. I'm going to tell you about God, but then or help in some way, and then leave and forget about you.
Yeah.
So I think there's like that, when you went back to that picture of like the ins and outs, sometimes you're in that middle of ground too, trying to do like bringing people into that. But if you don't have the relationships and things like that, it doesn't work.
Yeah. So one of the assumptions in that space, right, is that I have the thing you need, and if you'll just trust me, I'll give it to you in a way that will be what you need. Yeah.
So for about 6 years when we were missionaries at the end of our time, we had short-termers come, and I trained them in mime, which I got trained by disciple Marcel. And we did, so it was an intensive time for 2 weeks of doing short skits for about 2 hours on the streets. So people could come and go as they wanted. And we often have crowds of like 50 to 100 people if we're in a big plaza. And really the goal showing stories about love. And it was somewhat taking into account, we've been already living there about 10 years. So we were taking into account the culture to, the dress as well, clothing with all long sleeves and long hands and not too tight. And it was close enough to the culture that there would often be people like narrating to other people what's happening in the story.
Yeah.
But the reason we did it that way was because we knew we had friends who preached on the street, and then my husband would tell a story of the love of Jesus at the end, and do it in a conversational way. But there was tons of people wanting to talk to us, and individuals also. We all talked to people afterwards, because we weren't saying, here's something we have that you don't. We were bringing them stories. It was often parables from the Bible in the story. But, those are in the Middle East.
Yeah.
We were in the Middle East.
Yeah.
So they understood it. And the joy on their faces was like, oh, this is love. Oh, I like this. Interesting. This is attractive.
Yeah. If you didn't know, Dennis and Alexandra were missionaries in Turkey for a very long time. And part of what I love about that story is multifold. Number one, that it's imaginative and creative, right? I think part of what living a different way of a missional imagination, I think part of what happened in our world is that we lost what it means to be creative and imaginative and believe that God could do something new in different ways. But also I love, I think one of the assumptions that it holds is that the connection to love is deeper than our voice and what we can just talk about, right? There are other ways to connect to that love. Yeah, that's really beautiful. Hi. So, right, as we, again, like, what I don't want you to hear from me is what Lynn was hearing in regards to this is black and white. I'm not saying that. I am saying simultaneously, I'm not saying that, and there was a lot of darkness throughout the last multi-hundred years of our approaches to how we were missionally imagining what it is that we're doing. And part of that, I would argue, was how we understood God, what we were being saved from or to, what we were called to be, who we were as humans, right? All those other theologies that we talked about last week played into this story that we're telling or that we're sharing or that we're living even when we don't intend to, because these stories become embodied. Right? What we believe becomes embodied in how we act and move and engage.
So, here's a thought to try on.
Talk loud so it picks up.
Here's a thought to try on. The idea of migration is not, nobody wants to always be migrating, right? Like, that's not a good thing. You're supposed to migrate from A to B and then settle. And the migration time is the time in the wilderness, the time in the desert, the not great time. And so it's a necessity to get there. And I'm wondering if, like, I think back to, like, I don't know if all of you are familiar with E. Stanley Jones. He was a missionary in, like, the 1920s or 30s. He became friends with Gandhi. He ended up really influencing Martin Luther King. But the thing that his experience was the experience, Liz, that you were talking about, of he went there and not just Gandhi, but definitely Gandhi, like, made him see a totally different way of being faithful to Jesus that he's learning from not a follower of Jesus. And they kind of like, Gandhi joked with them that like, maybe we should like switch books because you guys are doing like war, and so the Bhagavad Gita would be great for you, and etc. But he had to find a way, and he even talked about like, if you show us a better way to be faithful to Jesus, we will sit at your feet. And then our Christianity and everything that we have around it is just like what worked for us. But that's not the point, that's the trappings. And I'm wondering if that's like, if that process of going into another culture and learning to love it and figuring out what works there is that migration for those people. And maybe for us, we have other places, we have to go to another place and migrate and figure out what works for us in the time that we're in, the space we're in our journey. But it's kind of about that transition and finding, I mean, it's going to mess up the two things, but I wonder if it's like, you could almost say like rather than thinking of it as centered set and bound set, maybe we need to have like a bound thing to feel safe and secure. And when we're in the other one, it's more like a migrating set where we're moving and trying to figure out what the right direction is so we can figure out where our little circle can be for the next moment.
Yeah, I think, again, like we can play with metaphor in 1,000 ways. I think that's as good a way as any. And I will argue with you that migration is about being in one place to another, right? In some ways. I think the whole thing's migration, right? I think the whole thing's journey. And I think what we like to do is sit in the bound set because it makes us comfortable. And sometimes we need to for healing and wellness and growth and relationships and that sort of thing. And I would argue that even in the sitting of that, you're also migrating, right? That there is movement happening. And that 9/10 of our life is the messy middle. And part of, I think, the problem with our historic theology that is causing issues for many, especially those who are deconstructing, is that it became about where we're headed and not about where we are. And so part of the challenge that I'm offering to us, right, is this this idea that part of what we inherited was about getting people to the right destination. And that destination could have looked differently for different groups, right? Like, it definitely looked different for my grandfather than other missionaries I encountered on the mission field, right? I remember I was 16, we were on the mission field doing a VBS, the reservation my grandfather lived on, and a Pentecostal group rolled into town, and they set up their big tent, and they were doing a tent revival, but they set it up on a Baptist church's site where we were doing our thing, and there was this relationship that was there. So a bunch of us went to the tent revival at night. We would do the VBS thing, and we were hearing a radically different story in that tent than I had heard at any point in my life. And at one point in the week, the pastor who was up there found out I was the missionary's son and brought me up on stage, and there was all this stuff that, and I remember being like just full of anxiety, right, about that bound set thing. Like, okay, this is not my tribe, and there was also some fascinating about the tribe. That's a weird metaphor to use when I'm talking about native grounds. But you get the picture, right? That there were lots of tribes in this space. And so there was something fascinating and energizing about that space as well. And we were having conversations in the evenings with my dad, who was the pastor, my grandfather, who was the missionary, all of the parents that had come with us, and were like, Derwin, my dad, why are you letting the kids go to the tent? They need to see, right? They need to, well, I can tell you a lot of other places where you wouldn't have been able to go to the tent. So I hear you, and I do agree, right? That we're migrating to something, and yet I think that the metaphor that Brian is offering us is more like the monarch butterflies than it is like the immigrating peoples. I think I'll be able to as I go, but if I don't, let's hit that again. I don't want to get stuck here because it's 8 o'clock. So there's this old model that we've talked about of mission, and again, when I say old, it doesn't mean bad, it's just different. There is a model of mission many of us inherited, and where it became negative was often it was more shaped by empire than by Jesus, right? Which is where we have to check these things every once in a while. And the point was to convert the people, but often the question became, was it to convert the people to Jesus or to the empire? To export the doctrine, to plant the church, to multiply the program, to defend the truth, to repeat over and over. And this missional imagination, theologically, I would argue, is shaped by scarcity and often by anxiety about what we don't know, about the places we're going, the people we're bumping into, about a lack of really understanding. A mindset that assumed that God was absent until we arrived. A worldview that was divided people into these insider-outsiders, saved, unsaved, enlightened, lost, name your us-them metaphor that you prefer. But when I look at Jesus, I see what he does is something very different. He doesn't enter the world to conquer it. He enters, right? The text talks about he enters as a baby. Doesn't seek converts, he seeks companions. He doesn't build an institution. He forms a table of people. He doesn't ask us to win. He asks us to love. These are very different movements. So in the stories of Jesus, conversion, as we often imagine it, I would say is pretty absent in some ways in the way that I grew up with conversion. What we see instead is transformation through encounter. So Zacchaeus encounters generosity, and then we don't know, like, this is the beautiful part of the story. We have no idea what happened there. The only thing we know at the end of it is he's like, yeah, here's giving this money back. I'm doing this thing, right? He encounters generosity, and through that, he becomes generous. The Samaritan woman who didn't belong encounters belonging, and then she becomes the first apostle, right? Proclaiming the message to the point that the whole town is transformed by the belonging that she experienced in God. The leper encounters recognition in a world where he was pushed away from even being recognized. Peter encounters forgiveness on a beach over breakfast. So this kingdom that Jesus announces it's very little. Yes, there are scriptures that talk about the separation of the sheep and the goats and those places, but it is much smaller than the kingdom being announced as a reweaving of creation so that all people flourish. So part of the migrating in this Christian story became about how do we evacuate? Like, how do we get on the train that shoots me up when the rapture happens? Right? What gets me to that? How do I get off this big rock that's gonna all burn up and be destroyed? Instead of about being a Christian story and a God story and a love story that has always been about participating with the divine. Here, in a place that we're actually the reconciling forces of good and love in our world to bring back order from the chaos. Not escape the world, but heal it. Not to colonize a culture, but to collaborate with a spirit who's already there and creating new life in the midst of it. This is what N.T. Wright calls imagining the kingdom. When the early Christians healed the sick, shared resources, built communities of mutual dignity, and proclaimed Christ's resurrection, they were not spreading a religion, according to N.T. Wright. They're just declaring a new creation. They're planting seeds in the soil of an empire so that one day the pavement gets cracked and new things grow up. So, what does it look like to have a new missional imagination? I think, and whether or not, no matter where you are in the waters, I think our world, the thing I'll put in the sand tonight, and then it'll all wash away in the morning, is that I don't care where we are in the waters in our own faith. I mean, I do care, but I don't have a preference for where you are in the waters. That's a lie. I do have a preference for where you are in the waters. But I'll be with you wherever you are in the water. I think one thing is defiantly true in this moment is that our world is asking for a different encounter than what it has been given from the church and religious people over the last 100 years. And I think we have to have real conversation as what I would deem us in this moment in Walnut Creek and in, frankly, the East Bay, as a missional outpost to people who are bouncing off of other bound sets and not finding a place to belong, and are searching for love and God and belonging and meaning and finding their way in this world. That as a missional outpost, somehow we have to develop a new missional imagination for what we're here on this planet to do, no matter where we are in the water. And I think part of the beauty that St. Matthew holds in the migrating is we actually have people all along the river, right? Like, there are people all along this river of faith, very divergent from each other. And yet we recognize that we're in the same water and that we're swimming together and we're moving and we're engaging in the midst of this. So I think there has to be some form of frame for how we're going to develop a missional imagination together. And so I thought of 4. And my challenge to you as you listen to these 4 is tell me what's missing as we develop a missional imagination together.
Did you say tell us what?
Tell me what's missing. And if you hate one of them, that's fine too. You can tell me that. I don't care.
Are these 4 on that sheet
These 4 are
somewhere?
on my notes, and they'll be in the dump ground that Mike has set up. But I can print this for you too. So the first one is, I think we have to learn to see where God is already at work in our neighborhoods. And stop believing that is only in a faith zone. That God is at work all around us in places that, in fact, I believe that part of what we need to do is look in the places where we least imagine God could be and ask God to tell us where God is already at work in that place. And this is my deepest belief in this moment, is that if we ask that question, God will reveal that in ways that we would never imagine. Leslie Newbegin says, the church does not bring God's mission to the world. The church discovers what God is already doing and joins it. Which I think this big picture of learning to see where God's already at work is going to require us to build some skills like listening before we speak, being radically curious before we develop strategies, being people who can do good cultural exegesis, being and asking what is holy in our neighborhood rather than how can I make my neighborhood holy. Learning the stories of our communities, looking for where it has wounds, but also where it has wonders. The second thing I think that it is going to require of us, which I think is going to be hard, is to begin to see the world through a non-dualistic lens. Being missional automatically fails whenever we create an us and them. Christian and secular, sacred profane, saved lost. Cynthia Bourgeau and Richard Rohr teach that non-duality, non-dualistic seeing is not about abandoning the truth. And I know that's what a lot of us worry about. Like when we step away from dualistic thought, and again, you heard me a few weeks ago say, there is value in dualism when it comes to teaching certain things. That's not what I'm talking about. But what I'm talking about is this form of dualism. It's not about abandoning the truth and saying, I can't know what is good and right and those things. It's about perceiving the interconnectedness of all things. Like, can I train myself to say, you know what, this is one of the conversations that Wayne and I have been having. Like, I've read the Quran once back in grad school. I've converted my fair share of Muslims when I was in Los Angeles, primarily because it meant that they could get U.S. citizenship once they had converted. They became refugee status because going home was dangerous. And so I went through a year where about 36 Iranian Muslims converted in our church and found their community at Bethel. And yet, in my heart of hearts, I knew they were still rooted Muslims, right? Like yet they were also meeting God in a really beautiful way. But I didn't have to be like, oh man, I didn't really save them, right? I don't hold that way. I just recognized what was happening in this moment was interconnected, and God was doing something that I'm just hanging on, right? I'm taking the next step, right? The next little light from my candle, lighting the next path. It's about that interconnectedness. The third goes to something that Alexander said about, there's something about cultivating creativity. Being missional is not a franchise, it's improvisation, right? I love to read books about improvisation. And what's the first death of any improvisational moment?
Right, wrong.
What was that? No.
Right, wrong.
Yeah, right, wrong. Right, wrong. Like when somebody asks you a question, you can never answer no. You have to do yes and, right? Like this is and those of you who know me, some of you hate this about me, I'm a yes and dude. Like I hear you and I'm like, yeah, and that being able to live in this, right? Jesus didn't hand out a manual. I know some of you are going to be like, yes, the Bible. He did not hand you that. Jesus handed out metaphors. Seeds, nets, lamps, yeast, tables, the tools of the artist for gardeners and cooks. So this missional imagination experiments. It tries new things. It risks failure. One of my favorite things about St. Matthew, when we interviewed you all through the shape, is our church has an 80% movement toward risk. 80% of our community, when they're asked, do you like risk? Like risk. That's very rare in a church. I love that. Sky Janthani, however you say his name, Sky Janthani, calls this seeing the world as a field of possibility rather than a battlefield of enemies. And the fourth in that, I think it requires for us to build a theology and ideology of the communal nature of missional living. We were not meant to do this life alone, right? We know culturally we're in an epidemic of loneliness. The two largest groups that affects are the two largest groups in Walnut Creek: youth and senior adults. The two largest populations in Walnut Creek. This journey, this missional imagination has to come to a point where I understand that unless we're doing this thing together, sometimes in difference, sometimes in deep agreement, that nothing else matters. Right? One of the things that we say in our Who is St. Matthew class is, we believe deeply that when you come to join us, we are now different. We're not asking you to merge. We're asking to be transformed by you. That when you take a place at our table, we're now a different group of people. And I have experienced that to be really true personally at St. Matthew over the last 5 years. That who we were 5 years ago is actually radically different than who we are right now. 60% of the community we have now wasn't here 5 years ago. And we try new things and we look differently, and somebody comes up with an idea and we're like, yeah, let's try it. As long as you lead it. I'm not doing another thing. Right? And this, for me, is like what I think about when I think about animal migration. That when I think about immigration, sometimes it's about how do I pay the coyote to sneak me across so I can be alive again? Very important, by the way. Like, really matters. I think about geese. There's a dumb kids cartoon about ducks migrating, and I can't remember. It's called The Migration, isn't it? It's really cute. There are these ducks. Ducks migrate every year, right? But there's this one set of family of ducks that they've found their spot, and the dad is like, you know what happens when you migrate? Bad stuff. And the kids, you have a little kid and a teenage kid, and they're just wanting to migrate. Dad, let's go. And they're, it's like vacation to Florida. That's the image that they're giving. We're going to Florida. Everybody's going to Florida, but we're not going to Florida. And he's like making the bed of straw, and he's making sure that they have food enough to eat, and he's doing these things. And the wife duck is saying, seriously, Bob, you're always like this. And then the birds come and land on their small spot of water, and there's this moment of disorientation, and then those ducks say, hey, why don't you come with us? Come on, come with us. And he meets this beautiful little girl duck that he wants to hook up with. And he's like, Dad, come on, right? Like every teenage story. And then at some point, the weather gets, so the ducks leave. But then the weather gets too violent where they are, and they realize they don't have a choice any longer, right? That this safe space, their own bound set, while it makes them comfortable, now the dad is like, okay, there's more risk here than taking off. And they take off, and it's this journey then of them trying to catch the other animals, and they're, they come across all of these messy situations. That for me is this beautiful value that I think in some ways, when the church decided it was going to be an entertainment company instead of the gathered community of Christ in an area, that got lost. And I think somehow we have to own that and live into that in a way that makes us all uncomfortable, that is so rooted in belonging and welcoming, and that, yes, we're going to be different because you're here, that we root ourselves so deeply in that it does create a shift, right? For those coming in as we're migrating together, and that we recognize that, yeah, like, I'm different because of the things that I learned from you. Jerry has me reading this book that's messing up my brain. And it's great. Right? This is the challenge that I gave you a couple weeks ago about you have control over what your lens is. So invite something else into that lens. Invite something of difference into that lens and hear from it and sit with it and be with it, because that's what's going to help us reclaim a communal nature of missionality, of being together in the presence of God as we're living in this journey of sometimes bounded and sometimes unbounded realities. So, those are my 4. I went from 10 to 4. And I included some of them in there, you could tell about other places. But what other ones do you have? What do you think we need to root ourselves in to develop a new missional imagination for our worlds, our neighborhood, our community?
Whatever we can do, which is I guess what you guys did last week, we didn't come, but to put yourself in somebody else's shoes is try to see the world from their eyes. You know that there's only one kind of olive tree that comes from California, that's called the California brand. Do you know what it's called? Mission. You know why it's called Mission? Because it came from over there. We are the foreigners to the Bible. We lived about an hour from Ephesus. We lived in Izmir, which was Smyrna. 100 years ago, it was still called Smyrna. Noah's Ark landed on the edge of the country. Pontus, where Peter writes to, was up on the Black Sea region. Galatians, that's Turkey. We were in the place where, and so we're the foreigners, actually. It's hard to see that until you've lived in a different culture, but if you just spend some time with somebody make a goal, I think you even said you did this, but make a goal of being around or reading or being around somebody that's very different than you. What you'll find is that you're probably not as different as you thought, probably, whatever the differences are. But I think that's a huge aspect of it. Where do we get an example of that? Well, technically, that's what we have Christmas. That's what Christmas is, right? God coming to a bad neighborhood.
Yeah.
Our neighborhood.
And pitching his tent there, right?
So I don't think it should, if any religion should be involved with that Christianity, that would be like our main thing. It should be like our main thing, but it doesn't seem like. It seems like no matter what, humans always want to make a little tribe and make a little cluster. But when I went to try to teach, I was trying to teach the Muslims how to read the Bible better, And then I would tell the story, and they would explain to me with the story, like, what is that whole thing with Jesus going and standing with the door knock? It makes no sense in Western culture. If you live in the Middle East, it makes perfect sense. Many of the stories make absolutely no sense, but we still preach on them. We still think we know what we're talking about. We have no idea. But I would tell stories, and the kids would explain to me what the stories were. And I go, you know what? They're right. That's something completely different. Because we are the foreigners. Most of the people in the Bible were living in the region where I was living. And they're the ancestors. So the tribes that my people came from, my last name is related to a fire god, a Celtic fire god. So I don't think I came from Christian stock.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's helpful. So again, I think it's this rooting. I love the understanding yourself as the foreigner and somebody else as the native is a posture that I think creates a new sense of openness instead of they're the foreigner and we're the native. Others?
Well, I think, and we've done it in a variety of different ways here, and at least in Lynn and I's lives, it's been life-changing, and that is that, and it's difficult because we are so comfortable, we really seek comfort. We might say we don't want to, but we really enjoy comfort.
I love comfort.
And we had an unbelievable ministry with homeless at Trinity for 8 to 10 years. And basically every week we're eating with those guys and women, and starting to understand their lives and where their lives have been. And we just sent 2 guys up to Fairfield into the prisons last weekend, and so we spent time the other day talking about that experience. Mm-hmm. And what that life for Christians there, lifers there, is like, and to start understanding that part of the broader community, because we have a real small community. Mm-hmm. So when I think about mission, it's not going out and preaching the gospel, though that's what we do. We just don't use words. That we come alongside of people and we learn who they are. We gain their trust. We learn to speak their languages. And that's part of what we're called to, and that's what Jesus did. He didn't stay in Jerusalem. Paul didn't stay in Jerusalem. They went all over the world into different communities.
Yep.
And brought people with them. And I think in terms of our missional program here is doing more of that.
And hear me, I want to be really clear. I'm not talking about a program.
No, it's not a program.
I'm talking about a way of being. Like, that it's not like I love that, you can still work with St. Matthew on Tuesdays and Thursdays and actually Monday through Saturday and still serve in one of Concord's parks and have the same experience, a similar experience to what you had. That program matters, right? Building programs of mission, that's not what we're talking about tonight. It's a part of how we experience it. But what I'm talking about tonight is what is the change of the frame of our minds. Be transformed by the renewing of your mind, right? And part of how you do that's experiential. I get you. I'm not arguing with you. I get you. 100%. I get you. And the question I'm asking as we close, because that's similar to what we've been saying, is it's about being with people who have a different experience than you. And you can do that in a program, or you can do it sitting at the restaurant that Mike and I sat at for lunch today after recording Advent devotionals, right? You can do it in 1,000 ways. Are there other renewing of our minds that are necessary? Cultivating creativity, seeing through a non-dual lens, learning to see where God is already at work, humility, listening, that would shift us, right, in a way. And again, I've been thinking about this stuff for months. I'm throwing it at you tonight. I don't expect you to have all the answers. I'm curious, is there something else that rises to your mind that we should be paying attention to this? I do.
One of philosophically to look at it is that all of life is a process, not static substances.
Yeah.
So any person we look at in ourselves, we're in the midst of the process of life. Constantly changing, constantly growing, constantly being influenced by each other. And that helps us not to judge people as being, one frame.
Yeah, and ourselves, by the way, for sure. That's the first week of stuff too, of like, it's important that we have a theology of movement, because we are always moving, right? And I mean, Dennis and I have talked about this before. Like I can't remember the amount of days, but in a certain amount of days, your entire self is no longer the self anymore. You've sloughed off, in your bed and in your, you've renewed all of that.
7 years.
7 years. Yeah. Like every 7 years, you're already, you're physiologically a different person. All right. Well,
How can a Democrat talk to a Republican?
Bring it in.
So you talk about being dualistic. That is our society today.
Yeah. I mean, I have lots of thoughts on that.
We have a lot of Republicans in our church, and we have a lot of Democrats in our church. We can experiment.
I do every Sunday, brother. Yeah. Yeah. I do every Sunday, and guess what? So do you. I think we got to stop making this thing again. I think we're going to stop making this an us-them thing. Like, my mom holds the political views that she holds, which are radically different than mine. And my mom's one of the most amazing women in the world. And she's way more complex than how she votes. And the reason that she votes the way she votes comes from 78 years of existence that has shaped and molded her into that spot. So what I would say, first off, is to get curious. Instead of getting judgmental, get curious. And, I think part of how we've gotten into the mess that we are today is because the church lost its way, and because humanity decided that humanity in the U.S. decided it was going to root itself in a deep form of dualistic division instead of really understanding a person. And then social media helped us. And it said, this algorithm is only going to put you with people who sound like you or think like you, or the exact opposite to piss you off so that you'll believe that everybody's like this. And then we sit and we watch our TVs, which tell us that same lie, instead of getting into the muddy mess of, you know what? Part of why my mom is, gosh, this is going to be on video. Let me think about how to say that differently.
Hi, Mom.
My mom has radically oriented views towards immigration and migration that are different than mine because she was a school teacher in the panhandle of Texas, where every year migrant workers came in, they farmed the cotton, and through the farming of the cotton, they entered their kids into our schools. And every fall, late fall, early winter, they would move on to go work another crop. And our school would lose about 30% of its funding because those kids would go back to Mexico, be back in their school, and they never enrolled in the U.S. again. And so because of how state policy works, we lost 30% of our money. Imagine being a school teacher who's having to figure out mid-year every year how they're going to deal with all of that. It created a moment, right? That created ideas, that created constructs. And then that's one story out of 1,000 stories I could tell you of living in a small farming community in West Texas that built these realities. When I moved there, there were two flats. There was the Mexican flats and the black flats. And everywhere else is where the white people lived. If you wanted to play fun basketball, you went to the black park. If you wanted to play boring basketball, you went to the white park. This is how we lived until we didn't. Until those things disappeared as I started moving into high school and those ideologies differentiated. But it formed people, right? And we all have those stories. But yet we come into places and we start saying, well, how do I talk to these people? You just talk to them. And know that everybody in this room holds a different opinion on something. And guess what? I don't like a lot of your opinions. I know I'm your pastor and I'm supposed to say that I do, but I don't. Which is frequently why I don't ask for opinions. Because it's safer for me. And often when I ask for your opinions, what you'll hear me say is, that's interesting. I think differently than that. And I don't need to say anything else. I don't believe it's my job to convince you to anything other than that you are a radically loved, born child of God. And so is everyone else. So if you're being mean to somebody else, I'm going to say to you, hey, can we stop that? Because people are being hurt by that. That's why I think we need a new missional imagination, is because the missional imagination we had in our world for the last 100 years, no matter how gray it was, hurt a lot of people, destroyed entire cultures and civilizations. And I'm going to call that out. And you should too. But it doesn't mean I have to hate those people. Because we're all in that, my therapist said one time, Rustin, please remember that there are people who go to therapy because of you. It's a really important thought to hold. Somebody else is in therapy because of the things that you handed them.
Those are our children.
Yeah. Those were our children. In fact, one of my favorite stories, and I'm 7 minutes over. One of my favorite stories was I did this huge parenting thing in Minneapolis when I was there, and I brought in this specialist in parenting, and he started the meeting by saying, so I just want to introduce myself. My name is, and I'm not going to say his name. I've had 2 families. My first family, I was an alcoholic. I was a horrible husband. My whole life fell apart. My wife divorced me. That kid, it's taken me 20 years for them to talk to me. And that kid's in therapy because of me. And then about 15 years ago, I met this amazing woman who also had gone through recovery, and we had a child together, and they're 6 and 7, and we're doing everything right. And they're going to be in therapy because of me. So, take a deep breath. Know that parenting is hard. And no matter what you do, people are going to be in therapy because of you. I think that's a really freeing construct. Right? About, like, because I think this is what, like, I think we hold these things so tight. And I think there are a few things we should hold on to. You are a beloved child of God. So are you. So are you. And so are you. There is nothing that can separate you from God's love. Want to migrate with me?
Something I find really beautiful about St. Matthew is that we have this crazy diversity of all sorts of different people, some like me who are right, and yet we're all kind of here, and we're all coming to hear the sermons, and so we're kind of going in the same direction in the places where it matters. And I don't know, I just think it's like, I think it really is true that like the wound of our country, maybe even the world, is that division of us versus them. And the only way to heal it is to heal it together, to spend time together, and not even really to have debates or conversations, just more like learn to love each other and just have relationships, and then you know the other person and care about the other person, and that's the answer. That's actually what changes minds, is caring, you know?
Yeah. It's one of the greatest gifts I thought I got from last week's message was this Bedouin Muslim doctor in a Jewish synagogue with a bunch of Christian people listening to her saying, like, the only hope is the civic engagement together, doing this engagement, being together, recognizing that as bombing was happening, she was caring for Bedouins and Muslims and Jews and Christians and you name it. And P.S., just humans. Yes. All beloved children of God. Right? And I love that too about St. Matthew. That I think it is the gift we offer the world. And may we do so with humility. So go in peace on a missional migration, but don't do it alone. Take somebody with you. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you.